maybe I'm gonna like the 38 better. On my Zeb, I had that high-speed compression dial. Nonetheless, here we are at Red Bull. No better place to test out a new fork. We got the Z1 Coil. Let's see what we got. What's up, guys? That is right. I have picked up a new fork for my Commencal Clash, and if you recall, I run this bike in a Mullet setup. So 29 wheel up front and a 27.5 in the rear, and the new fork is the Marzocchi Bomber Z1 Coil. You may be wondering why, and obviously coils are super hot right now, and I wanted to get in on the fun. I've used a coil fork once before. It was a MRP ribbon and it was on a Santa Cruz Tallboy. It didn't necessarily jive with me, so I wanted to try it on this bike and see how it felt, and I gotta say, I'm definitely a fan. Initial impressions are super good. Just like a coil shock, a lot of people love a coil because of that small bump sensitivity that you get, and I have to say, I can definitely feel that. When I'm going through the rocks, you can tell it feels like the front end of this bike is glued to the ground. And I was a little worried about that because I thought, well, maybe when I try to jump, it's not gonna pop quite the same, but no, it feels amazing all around. It removes that harshness that you get on those initial small bumps, and then the support all the way through is really nice. Marzocchi, when they created this fork, they made it so that it's slightly progressive at the very end of the travel range, so that way you can still have some bottom out resistance and you're not just slamming all the way through the coil because of that linear suspension. If you remember from my Mullet conversion video, you'll recall anytime you're putting a new fork on a bike, you have to take the axle of the crown into account. If you're unfamiliar with the Bomber Z1, it's actually a Fox 36 rhythm fork. So because of that, I no longer am running a 160 mil of travel. Instead, I bumped it up to 170 now. Fox 36 compared to a 38 or a Zeb runs a slightly shorter axle of the crown, so you can increase that fork travel. So I'm back to 170, which matches the rear travel of my bike at 170 mil as well. Now, the 36 rhythm frame is actually one I was really excited to try out, because what I love about the Zeb in the 38 is the stiffness that you get over a 36. And initially, I'll be honest, I was skeptical about that stiffness when they first released the Zeb. I'm a lightweight rider. I only weigh about 155 pounds. I don't have a need for a really stiff fork. So I thought maybe I'd be able to compromise with this fork and try out that 36 rhythm due to the construction and the materials that they use. Now that I've had the opportunity to test this fork a little bit, I have to say, I truly do think I can tell a difference in that stiffness. And I don't really notice it in a straight line, but where I do notice it is going around corners. When I really try to force it into a corner, especially if it's a technical corner with some rocks or bumps in it, I feel like the bike kind of wants to dance around a little bit, whereas with my Zeb, I remembered it being more planted. There is a slight geometry difference with this and the 170 mil bump, but it only is 4 millimeters in the axle of the crown compared to my 160 Zeb and the 170 that I have now. So I don't think that it's that 4 millimeter difference that affected the head tube angle. That's only probably 1/4 of a degree. I don't think that's what I'm perceiving on the trail. Any Marzocchi fanboys out there may have noticed that I actually have a blue dial on my Z1, and if you know, these come from the factory with a gold dial for the low speed compression. To further show how Fox and Marzocchi are the same company, I took the dial off of my Fox 38 and swapped it onto here because honestly, it just looks better. Having the blue dial with my silver bike and the rest of the way my bike is set up, the aesthetics are much more pleasing. The gold dial looks sick, and especially if you put it on a black bike, it looks amazing. But on my silver finish bike, I thought it was kind of clashing and I didn't really dig it. So now I got the blue grip dial on there and we're good to go. Speaking of the blue low speed compression dial, this Z1 Coil comes spec'd with a Fox grip damper, and I have to say, I really enjoy it. I actually enjoy it more than I did on my Fox 38. The Fox 38, I never felt like I could get it quite dialed, but now it feels great. And if you really want to, you can actually swap it out and you can put a Grip 2 damper in this. However, it is a pretty expensive upgrade. In order to get a Grip 2 damper, it's like $250, $300 or something like that. And I'm not certain it's something that I really really think is necessary for this. Because the coil is overall more simple, I'm perfectly fine with the grip damper. I don't really think I need the higher level grip 2 in order to get high speed compression. Speaking of the spring, Marzocchi has a really handy chart that they provide to riders so you can figure out what spring you need for your riding style and body weight. For me, it's the medium spring, which conveniently enough comes spec'd with the fork from the factory. So I was able to use the stock spring, and that covers a wide range of body weights. I think it was about 150 pounds to 170 or so. And because I'm a really aggressive rider and I was on the lower end of that spectrum, I knew the medium spring would feel about right. And it does. It's right where I need it to be. My sag is set properly, and I haven't had any issues with bottom out yet. I've gotten close, but it was a nice smooth transition, no harshness or anything, and I'm really excited about that. Because of the new fork and having a coil inside, it also affects the way that I need to have the shock set up. I wanted to make sure that the bike still felt balanced. This coil is a bit more supportive throughout the travel than my previous air spring was that was in my Zeb. So I wanted to match that with my shock and make my shock feel a bit more supportive as well. So I increased pressure a little bit as well as low speed compression until I was able to get it right where I wanted it so that the bike felt good. There's also some additional adjustments I'll be making in the future, maybe even possible that I'm gonna swap out the shock, but if you wanna see that, you'll have to be sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you can keep up to date on the latest and greatest improvements I'm making to my Clash. Speaking of shock setup, whenever it comes to setting up my shock, I always just follow factory recommendations. So I set air pressure to accommodate for the appropriate sag, and then I set compression and rebound adjustments based on the factory recommendations, and from there I just adjust while I'm out on the trail. If I feel like I need to add a little bit more compression or adjust rebound, I do based on the trail that I'm riding, and just making the bike feel balanced. I think that's really the most important thing, is making sure the feel of the fork matches the feel of the shock and what's happening in the rear of the bike for when you're riding across terrain. So there you have it. That is my new Marzocchi Z1 Bomber coil fork. I'm really stoked about it. I've been riding it for about a month now, getting a feel for it. That way I could give you guys a proper review, as well as some pros and cons and my overall thoughts on it, as well as how it adapted to my Commencal Clash that I have since mulleted. So I'm also gonna be putting out a video on how you too can swap your fork, and it'll teach you how to install a fork. So stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where to ride next. Have you ever wondered why they call it a kickstand? Hiya! And that's why they call it a kickstand.